the star that only appeared on birthday. Well now, before I get started with this tale that's been weighing on my heart for nigh on 40 years, I'm going to ask you folks to do me a kindness. If you're finding comfort in these old stories of mine, would you mind hitting that subscribe button down there? And if this story touches your soul the way it still touches mine, give it a like. These tales need telling, and your support helps me keep the porch light on for more evenings like this one. Now, settle in with your coffee or sweet tea, because this story is going to take us on a journey through time, love, and the kind of magic that only shows itself to those who truly believe. The sun's setting behind these old oak trees, just like it did that summer of 1962, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. I was 23 then, still green as spring grass, but thinking I knew everything there was to know about life. Funny how time has a way of teaching you that the more you learn, the less you realize you knew to begin with. I was working the Henderson Ranch that summer, about 50 miles north of here in a little town called Cedar Springs. Population maybe 300 on a good day when the church bells were ringing. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business before they knew it themselves, where a handshake meant more than any contract, and where the general store still ran tabs for folks going through hard times. Now, the Henderson Ranch was something to behold. 3,000 acres of rolling hills, golden wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, and the prettiest creek you ever did see running right through the middle of it all. Old Man Henderson, rest his soul, was tougher than a $2 steak, but had a heart bigger than Texas. He'd taken me on when I was just drifting through town, no family to speak of, just a young man with calloused hands and a willingness to work from sunup to sundown. The ranch hand's quarters were simple but comfortable. A long bunkhouse with 8 beds, each with a small wooden chest for personal belongings. The walls were thick timber, and the roof was tin that would sing you to sleep when the rain came calling. There was a big stone fireplace at one end where we'd gather on cold evenings, sharing stories and playing cards until our eyes grew heavy. It was there I first heard tell of the birthday star from Jeremiah, the oldest hand on the ranch. Jeremiah was pushing 70, had been working ranches since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His face was like old leather, weathered and lined, but his eyes still sparkled with the mischief of a schoolboy. He had this way of telling stories that made you lean in close, hanging on every word like it might be your last chance to hear such wisdom. You boys ever heard of a birthday star? Jeremiah asked one evening in late June. We were all sitting around after a particularly long day of mending fences and moving cattle. The fire was crackling, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. Tommy, who was about my age but twice as cocky, laughed and said, "That's some kind of fairy tale, old man." Jeremiah's eyes got real serious then, and he fixed Tommy with a stare that could have stopped a charging bull. Boy, there are more mysteries in this world than your young mind can fathom. The birthday star is real as the ground you're sitting on, real as the air you're breathing. He took a long sip of his coffee and settled back in his chair, the firelight dancing across his weathered features. A birthday star is a celestial gift, appears only once a year on the same day, but only for those who truly need its light. Most folks live their whole lives without ever seeing one because they're looking for the wrong things in all the wrong places. Frank, another hand who'd been quiet most of the evening, spoke up. "You seen one yourself, Jeremiah?" The old cowboy nodded slowly. "Once. 23 years ago, come this September. Changed my whole life, it did. But that's a story for another evening." He stood up and stretched, his joints creaking like old floorboards. "Just remember, boys, when you're searching for something real important, sometimes the universe has a way of helping you find it. You just got to keep your eyes and your heart open." Well, we all figured it was just an old man's fancy, but something about the way Jeremiah spoke made those words stick in my mind like burrs on a saddle blanket. Little did I know how those words would come to mean everything to me just a few weeks later. Life on the Henderson Ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Up before dawn, coffee black as midnight, then out to tend the cattle and horses. Old Man Henderson had some of the finest quarter horses in 3 counties, and working with them was pure poetry. There's something about the connection between a man and a horse that can't be explained with words, only felt in the soul. The work was hard but honest. Mending fences under the blazing sun, driving cattle to better grazing, hauling hay bales that seemed to weigh as much as a full-grown steer. But there was satisfaction in it, the kind of bone-deep contentment that comes from using your hands to build something meaningful. The other hands were good men, each with their own story that had led them to this little corner of the world. There was Big Jim, who stood 6'6" and was gentle as a lamb despite looking like he could wrestle a bear and win. He'd lost his family farm in a flood and was saving every penny to buy another piece of land. There was Carlos, who'd come up from Mexico with dreams of American citizenship and worked twice as hard as anyone to prove his worth. And Quiet Frank, who never talked about his past, but had hands that could fix anything mechanical and away with the horses that bordered on magical. Every Saturday evening, we'd ride into Cedar Springs for supplies and maybe a beer at Murphy's Saloon. It wasn't much to look at. Murphy's place, just a simple wooden building with swinging doors and sawdust on the floor. But it was the heart of the community, where ranchers and farmers would gather to discuss weather, cattle prices, and swap stories that got taller with each telling. It was at Murphy's that I first laid eyes on Sarah Mae Collins. Lord Almighty, that woman could stop traffic on Main Street just by walking to the general store. She had hair the color of autumn wheat, eyes blue as a summer sky, and a smile that could melt snow in January. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught my attention, though she was surely the prettiest thing in 3 counties. It was the way she carried herself, with quiet dignity and strength, the way she spoke to everyone with genuine kindness, from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest drifter. Sarah Mae worked at the general store for her uncle, Silas Collins, who'd raised her after her parents died in a wagon accident when she was just 12. She had a head for numbers and a heart for people, could calculate your bill faster than you could count it out, and always remembered to ask about your family or your crops or whatever was weighing on your mind. The first time I worked up the courage to actually speak to her beyond howdy and thank you, ma'am, was on a sweltering July afternoon. I come into town to pick up some veterinary supplies for a sick calf, and she was behind the counter looking pretty as a picture in a blue cotton dress that matched her eyes. "Hot enough for you, cowboy?" she asked with a smile that made my heart skip like a flat stone on water. "Yes, ma'am. Surely is." I managed to stammer, suddenly feeling like my tongue was made of cotton. "Though I reckon it's a mite cooler in here with you brightening up the place." She laughed, and it was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. My, you ranch hands certainly know how to sweet-talk a girl. What brings you to town today?" I explained about the sick calf, and her expression grew serious with genuine concern. "Poor little thing. You make sure to give her plenty of fresh water and keep her in the shade. Sometimes when they're feeling poorly, a little extra attention goes a long way." As she gathered the supplies I needed, we talked about the weather, the ranch, her work at the store. I found myself lingering, reluctant to leave her presence. There was something about Sarah Mae that made me feel like I'd been sleepwalking my whole life and was just now waking up. "Same time next week?" she asked as I prepared to leave. "Yes, ma'am, if not sooner," I replied, and her smile told me she wouldn't mind if it was sooner. Walking back to my horse, I felt like I was floating 3 feet off the ground. Big Jim, who'd been waiting for me outside, took one look at my face and started laughing. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," he said, slapping his knee. "Young Jake's gone and got himself smitten with Miss Sarah Mae." "Don't know what you're talking about," I protested, but my burning cheeks probably gave me away. "Son, I've seen that look before. You're about as lovesick as a calf separated from its mama. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" That became the question that occupied most of my waking thoughts for the next several weeks. I found excuses to come to town more often, always stopping by the general store for some supply or another. Sarah Mae and I would talk, and I began to learn about her dreams and hopes, her love for books and music, her desire to see more of the world beyond Cedar Springs. She told me about her parents, how they'd been traveling to visit relatives when their wagon broke on a steep hill. The wagon had overturned, and they'd both died instantly, leaving 12-year-old Sarah Mae orphaned and heartbroken. Her uncle Silas had taken her in without hesitation, treating her like the daughter he'd never had. "Uncle Silas is good to me," she said one afternoon as we sat on the porch behind the store, watching the sun paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. But sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if Mama and Papa had lived. They were planning to homestead further west, maybe California or Oregon. Papa used to tell me stories about the ocean, how it stretches on forever and changes color with the sky. You ever think about going west yourself? I asked, though the thought of her leaving made my chest feel tight. She was quiet for a long moment, then smiled that soft smile of hers. Sometimes. But then I think about Uncle Silas, how he gave up his bachelor ways to raise a grieving girl. I couldn't just up and leave him now. Besides, she looked at me with those blue eyes that seemed to see right into my soul. Maybe what I'm looking for isn't in some far-off place. Maybe it's right here, if I'm brave enough to reach for it. My heart started beating like a drum at a barn dance, and I was about to say something that might have changed everything right then and there when Uncle Silas called from inside the store that he needed Sarah May's help with inventory. As summer turned to early fall, my feelings for Sarah May grew stronger than a rope under strain. I'd lie awake in my bunk at night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her laugh, her smile, the way she'd tuck a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating on something. The other hand started teasing me something fierce, but it was all good-natured ribbing for men who understood what it meant to find something worth treasuring. The problem was, I wasn't the only one who'd noticed Sarah May's charms. There was another suitor, and he posed a considerable challenge to a simple ranch hand like myself. His name was Bartholomew Ashford III, and he was everything I wasn't. Rich, educated, smooth-talking, and dressed in fine clothes that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. He was the son of a wealthy cattle baron from back east who'd come to Cedar Springs to expand his father's business interests. He stayed at the town's only boarding house, ate his meals at the hotel restaurant instead of Murphy's Saloon, and generally conducted himself like he owned the place. Bartholomew, who insisted everyone call him Bart, had taken quite a shine to Sarah May. He'd come into the store every few days, not to buy anything substantial, but to shower her with compliments and expensive gifts. He brought her books of poetry from back east, bottles of fancy perfume, even a music box that played a waltz when you opened the lid. The worst part was, Sarah May was too polite to refuse his gifts, though I could tell they made her uncomfortable. She'd thank him graciously, but set the items aside, never using the perfume or displaying the music box prominently. That Ashford fellow's been sniffing around Miss Sarah May again, Big Jim reported one evening after a trip to town. Saw him walking her home from church on Sunday, carrying a bouquet of flowers bigger than a haystack. My stomach dropped like a stone in a well. She seemed happy about it. Frank, who didn't speak much but observed everything, shook his head. Didn't look happy to me. Looked like she was being polite, nothing more. But that fella's persistent as a hungry mosquito. Jeremiah, who'd been whittling a piece of wood by the fire, looked up with those wise old eyes. Sometimes, Jake, a man's got to make his intentions known before someone else stakes a claim on what should rightfully be his. Waiting for the perfect moment is fine, but sometimes the perfect moment is the one where you finally stop waiting. I knew he was right, but the thought of declaring my feelings to Sarah May scared me more than breaking a wild bronco. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if she preferred Bartholomew's fancy gifts and smooth talk to my rough hands and simple words? What if I made a fool of myself and ruined the friendship we'd built? But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It was a Thursday evening in late September when everything changed. I'd ridden into town to deliver a message from Old Man Henderson to the bank about a cattle sale. The sun was setting, painting the main street in golden light, when I heard music coming from the direction of the church. The Cedar Springs Community Church held social gatherings on Thursday evenings, with music and dancing and refreshments prepared by the church ladies. It was a wholesome way for the community to come together, for young folks to socialize under the watchful eyes of their elders, and for everyone to forget their troubles for a few hours. I tied my horse to the hitching post and wandered over, drawn by the sound of fiddle music and laughter. Through the open church doors, I could see couples dancing, children running around playing tag, and older folks sitting in chairs around the perimeter, visiting and keeping time to the music with their feet. And there, in the middle of it all, was Sarah May dancing with Bartholomew Ashford. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, made of deep green fabric that brought out the gold in her hair. She looked beautiful, but there was something in her expression that didn't match the festive atmosphere. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was going through the motions of enjoying herself, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. Bartholomew, on the other hand, was clearly having the time of his life. He was spinning her around the dance floor with practiced ease, his expensive suit marking him as a man of means, his confident manner suggesting he felt quite sure of his chances with the prettiest girl in Cedar Springs. I was about to turn around and head back to the ranch, feeling like an intruder at a party where I didn't belong, when Sarah May's eyes met mine across the crowded room. For just a moment, her forced smile became genuine, and she gave me a small wave. That little gesture gave me the courage to step inside. The church ladies, bless their hearts, immediately descended upon me with offers of punch and cake. Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife, was particularly insistent that I try her apple spice cake, which she claimed had won the county fair 3 years running. "Jake, dear, you simply must dance tonight," she said, pressing a cup of punch into my hands. "All work and no play makes for a very dull young man." "I appreciate the sentiment, ma'am, but I'm not much of a dancer," I replied, which was the honest truth. Ranch hands don't get much opportunity to practice the finer social graces. Nonsense. Dancing is just like riding a horse. Once you learn the rhythm, you never forget. She looked around the room with the calculating eye of a professional matchmaker. "Now, who would make a suitable partner for you?" Before I could protest, she was steering me toward where Sarah May stood with Bartholomew near the refreshment table. They appeared to be having an intense conversation, and Bartholomew looked somewhat frustrated. "Sarah May, dear," Mrs. Henderson called out. "You remember Jake from the Henderson Ranch, don't you? He's looking for a dancing partner, and I told you the finest dancer in 3 counties. Sarah May's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine relief. "Why, I'd be delighted to dance with Jake." She turned to Bartholomew with an apologetic smile. "You don't mind, do you, Bart? I did promise Mrs. Henderson I'd make sure all the young men felt welcome." Bartholomew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his breeding wouldn't allow him to object publicly. "Of course not, my dear. I'll just wait right here for you." Sarah May took my arm and led me toward the dance floor just as the fiddle player struck up a slow waltz. My hands were sweating, and my heart was pounding like I was about to face down a rattlesnake. "I should warn you," I whispered as we took our positions. "I've got 2 left feet and the rhythm of a 3-legged dog." She laughed, and for the first time that evening, it sounded completely natural. "Just follow my lead and try not to step on my toes too often." The first few moments were awkward, I'll admit. I was concentrating so hard on not making a fool of myself that I was stiff as a board. But Sarah May was patient and encouraging, and gradually I began to relax into the rhythm of the music. "There, you see," she said softly as we swayed together. "You're doing just fine." Being that close to her, smelling the faint scent of lavender in her hair, feeling the warmth of her hand in mine, was both wonderful and torturous. I wanted to tell her how I felt, wanted to ask if she might consider a future with a simple ranch hand, but the words seemed to stick in my throat. "Jake," she said quietly, so only I could hear, "can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you're going through the motions of what people expect, but it's not really what you want?" The question surprised me with its depth and honesty. I reckon everyone feels that way sometimes. "Why do you ask?" She glanced over toward where Bartholomew was watching us with barely concealed impatience, then back to me. "Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in a story someone else is writing. Uncle Silas thinks Bartholomew would be a good match for me. He's wealthy, well-educated, could provide security and social standing. Everyone thinks I should be thrilled by his attention. But you're not." She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "I keep thinking about what my parents would have wanted for me. They were simple people who worked hard and loved deeply. Papa used to tell me that the measure of a man isn't in his bank account or his fancy clothes, but in his character and his willingness to work for what matters." The music was winding down, and I knew our dance would end soon. This might be my only chance to speak from the heart. "Sarah May," I began, then stopped, overcome by the magnitude of what I wanted to say. Yes, that is, I've grown mighty fond of you. More than fond, if I'm being honest. I know I'm not much compared to fellas like Bartholomew, but the music ended, and before I could finish, Bartholomew was there, taking Sarah May's arm with a possessive grip that made my jaw clench. "Thank you for the dance, Jake," Sarah May said, her eyes holding mine for just a moment longer than necessary. "Perhaps we can continue our conversation another time." As Bartholomew led her away, I heard him say something about taking her for a moonlight stroll, and I felt like I'd missed the most important opportunity of my life. I left the church social feeling lower than a snake's belly, convinced I'd lost my chance with the only woman who'd ever made my heart race. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, and even the familiar sounds of crickets and night birds couldn't lift my spirits. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Old Man Henderson called all the hands together after breakfast, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. He was holding a letter in his weathered hands, and his usual commanding presence seemed somehow diminished. "Boys," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I've received some difficult news. My brother Thomas, down in San Antonio, has taken gravely ill. The doctors don't expect him to recover, and his wife asked me to come as soon as possible." Thomas Henderson had been Old Man Henderson's business partner as well as his brother, and they owned several properties together throughout Texas. If Thomas was dying, there would be significant business matters to sort out. "I'll be leaving tomorrow morning and don't expect to return for several weeks, possibly months," Henderson continued. "Jake, I'm putting you in charge of the day-to-day operations. You've shown good judgment and leadership, and the other men respect you." The responsibility was both an honor and a burden. Managing 3,000 acres and a dozen ranch hands was no small task, especially during the busy fall season when cattle needed to be moved to winter pastures and preparations made for the harsh months ahead. "Carlos will be your second in command," Henderson went on. "Frank, you'll handle all the mechanical repairs and maintenance. Big Jim, you're in charge of the livestock health and feeding schedules. Jeremiah, I know you're getting on in years, but your wisdom and experience will be invaluable in guiding these younger men." That evening, as Henderson packed his belongings and went over the ranch accounts with me, he pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Jake, I've been watching you these past months, and I see something special in you. You've got the makings of a fine ranch manager, maybe even a landowner yourself someday if you set your mind to it." "Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you." "There's something else," he said, his eyes twinkling with what might have been mischief. "I've seen the way you look at Miss Sarah May Collins, and unless I'm mistaken, she looks at you the same way. Don't let fear or pride keep you from speaking your heart, son. Life's too short for regrets." The next morning, Old Man Henderson departed for San Antonio, leaving me with more responsibility than I'd ever carried and advice that echoed in my mind like church bells on Sunday morning. The first few days of managing the ranch went smoothly enough. The weather was cooperating, the cattle were healthy, and the other hands stepped up to help shoulder the increased workload. But on the fourth day, trouble arrived in the form of Eli Garrett and his gang of cattle rustlers. Cattle rustling was a serious problem in those days, with organized gangs of thieves who would steal livestock and drive them to distant markets where they could be sold without questions. Eli Garrett was known throughout the region as one of the most dangerous rustlers, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use violence against anyone who got in his way. It was Carlos who spotted them first, riding hard toward the ranch house just after dawn with news that chilled my blood. "Jake, we got big trouble," he said, his horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride. "I was checking the north pasture, and I seen at least 8 men moving our cattle toward Dead Horse Canyon. I recognized Eli Garrett from the wanted posters in town. Dead Horse Canyon was a narrow passage through the hills that led to a series of trails known only to outlaws and rustlers. Once the cattle were driven through that canyon, they'd be nearly impossible to track or recover. I quickly gathered the other hands and explained the situation. We had 2 choices: ride to town for the sheriff, which would take at least 2 hours and probably mean losing the cattle forever, or confront the rustlers ourselves and try to stop them. Those cattle represent months of work and thousands of dollars, I told the men, Old Man Henderson trusted us to protect his property, and I don't intend to let him down. But I won't ask any man to risk his life who doesn't want to. This isn't going to be easy or safe. To a man, they all volunteered to ride with me. Even Jeremiah, despite his age, insisted on coming along. Been dealing with rustlers since before you were born, boy, he said, checking his rifle. Besides, someone's got to keep you young hotshots from doing anything too foolish. We rode hard toward Dead Horse Canyon, hoping to intercept the rustlers before they could escape with Henderson's cattle. The morning was crisp and clear, with frost still glittering on the grass in shaded areas. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for a ride. As we approached the canyon, we could hear the sound of cattle moving through the narrow passage, accompanied by the shouts and whistles of the men driving them. I signaled for the others to spread out, hoping to surround the rustlers and cut off their escape route. What happened next is something I'll remember until my dying day. As we crested a small hill overlooking the canyon entrance, we could see the full scope of what we were up against. 8 rustlers, all armed and dangerous looking, were driving about 50 head of Henderson's best cattle through the narrow passage. Eli Garrett himself was easy to spot, a big man with a black beard and a reputation for violence that stretched across 3 states. "Looks like we're outnumbered," Frank said quietly, his eyes never leaving the rustlers below. "Maybe in bodies," I replied, "but we've got something they don't have. We're fighting for what's right, and that counts for a lot." I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted down into the canyon. "Eli Garrett, this is Jake Morrison from the Henderson Ranch. You're stealing our cattle, and we're here to take them back." The effect was immediate. The rustlers stopped driving the cattle and began reaching for their weapons. Garrett himself rode out from the group, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Well," he called back, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "If it isn't a bunch of ranch hands playing at being lawmen, you boys better turn around and ride home before someone gets hurt. The only ones getting hurt are going to be cattle thieves," I shouted back. "Release those cattle and ride out, and we'll let you go. Keep pushing, and we'll stop yourselves." Garrett laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "You and what army, boy? I count 6 of you against 8 of us, and we're better armed and more experienced." "Maybe so," I replied, "but we're fighting for our home and our livelihood. That makes us more dangerous than you might think." For a tense moment, neither side moved. The cattle were milling around nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Then Garrett made his decision, going for his gun in a movement so fast it was almost a blur. What followed was the most intense few minutes of my life. Gunshots echoed through the canyon as both sides took cover behind rocks and trees. The cattle, spooked by the noise, began stampeding in all directions, making the situation even more chaotic and dangerous. Big Jim took a bullet in the shoulder early in the fight, but kept shooting with his good arm. Carlos managed to work his way around to the side of the canyon and started picking off rustlers from an elevated position. Frank's rifle skills, honed during his mysterious past, proved invaluable as he provided covering fire for the rest of us. But it was old Jeremiah who turned the tide of the battle in our favor. During a lull in the shooting, I heard him shout from his position behind a large boulder, "Boys, I'm going to try something that might sound crazy, but trust me on this one." Before any of us could ask what he meant, Jeremiah stood up fully exposed and began walking slowly toward the rustler's position, his rifle held casually at his side. The rustlers were so surprised by this apparent act of suicide that they stopped shooting, unsure what to make of it. "Eli Garrett," Jeremiah called out in a voice that carried absolute authority. "I know your daddy, Elijah Garrett Sr., from way back when we both worked the cattle drives up from Mexico. Good man, your daddy, honest as the day is long. He'd be mighty ashamed to see what his boy has become." I could see Garrett's face from where I was hidden, and Jeremiah's words hit him like a physical blow. His gun hand began to waver. "You don't know nothing about my daddy," Garrett shouted back, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I know he raised you better than this," Jeremiah continued, still walking slowly forward. "I know he taught you the difference between right and wrong, and I know he didn't raise his son to be a common thief. The psychological warfare was working. Several of the other rustlers were looking uncertainly at their leader, sensing his sudden doubt. The moral authority in Jeremiah's voice was undeniable, and it was shaking their confidence. "Your daddy saved my life once," Jeremiah went on, now close enough that he was well within pistol range. "Pulled me out of a river when my horse threw me during a flash flood. Said no man should die alone and forgotten. I've been carrying that debt for 20 years, and I reckon the best way to pay it back is to keep his son from making a mistake that'll follow him to the grave." Garrett's gun hand was shaking now, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. The other rustlers were looking back and forth between their leader and the old cowboy who seemed to have cast some kind of spell over the entire situation. Finally, Garrett lowered his weapon. "You boys take the cattle and get out of here," he said to his men, his voice heavy with defeat. "This ain't worth dying for." "But boss," one of the rustlers protested, "we came all this way for them cattle." "I said we're leaving," Garrett snapped, his authority reasserting itself. "Anyone who wants to argue about it can find themselves a new gang." Within minutes, the rustlers had mounted up and were riding away from the canyon, leaving Henderson's cattle behind. As they departed, Eli Garrett rode over to where Jeremiah was standing. "You tell my daddy you seen me. If you ever cross paths again," he said quietly, Tell him I'm trying to do better." "I'll do that, son," Jeremiah replied. And Eli, "It's never too late to change course. Your daddy would be proud to see you make an honest living." Garrett nodded once, then spurred his horse and rode after his men, disappearing into the maze of canyons and trails that crisscrossed the region. The ride back to the ranch was triumphant, but subdued. We'd won the day and saved Henderson's cattle, but we all understood how close we'd come to a much darker outcome. Big Jim's shoulder wound needed tending, and we were all exhausted from the stress and adrenaline of the confrontation. That evening, as we sat around the fire sharing the story over and over, each telling growing more elaborate than the last, I found myself looking at these men with new respect and appreciation. They'd risked their lives for the ranch, for Old Man Henderson, and for each other. It was the kind of loyalty and courage that couldn't be bought at any price. "Jeremiah," I said during a quiet moment, "what you did today was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen. How did you know it would work?" The old cowboy smiled and took a sip of his coffee. "Sometimes, Jake, you gotta trust that there's still some good left in Eve.